Welcome to the Lean AI podcast, where we're flipping the AI conversation on its head by focusing on holistic strategies and tactics that drive AI adoption, rather than focusing solely on overcoming the technical challenges of AI. In every Season 1 episode of the Lean AI podcast, we talk with corporate AI leaders just like you, who've uncovered secrets of driving successful AI adoption with far less wasted time and investment. Our guests challenge established views and offer disruptive perspectives, providing new actionable insights. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Lean AI podcast. Today, we're excited to welcome Mike Hollinger, an AI leader and chief architect with over 19 years of experience building cross-functional global teams and establishing new product offerings. He's known for launching and scaling products, especially in white space areas, most recently launching and growing a new AI product to over 35 million of combined software, hardware, and services revenue. He's currently a master inventor and distinguished engineer at IBM, as well as president of the Austin AI Alliance. Mike, welcome. We're thrilled to have you on the show.
Ben, it's my pleasure. And howdy from Austin.
Glad to have you. So Mike, before we get into the kind of the do's and don'ts that you see out there and maybe some advice that you could give some fellow corporate AI executives, could you tell us a little bit about your career background?
Of course. My background has been in kind of sitting in the layers between things or trying to find the edges between different parts of our systems. I actually have a background in hardware engineering and was writing firmware for hardware teams and got into from different layers of the stack, kind of moving up and up into different parts of solutions. And that's how I actually got into the AI space. At IBM, we built number 1 and number 2 supercomputers in the world at the time, Summit and Sierra, and did that in partnership with a couple of the companies, NVIDIA and Mellanox, and realized, hey, we need a software stack to go with this great solution. Our team built out that software stack, and I became one of the integration leaders for the top layer of it, which is that thing you mentioned in the intro. And it's just been a neat ride. Now my job is to help our clients understand how to apply AI. So I stick to saying I work on applied AI as opposed to fundamental research, because it's trying to understand, well, this is your problem. This is what you're seeing in the day-to-day. And here's how we can help you. And the technology we're going to use is going to maybe be this, maybe something fancy, maybe something that's done in a spreadsheet for all that matters. And that's the value that we create.
In our conversations leading up to this recording, you shared with me your perspectives and insights and kind of the do's and don'ts that you would recommend. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the mistakes that you've made or you've seen other corporate AI executives that the mistakes they've made so that we can get a sense of what not to do? And then we'll jump a little bit later into your recommendations on what to do.
Oh, of course. I mean, the biggest one is just jumping in from the get-go and saying, hey, we're going to use AI. And that's the declaration. And people just start building things, right? They start building without really understanding what is the intent behind the outcome. One of my good colleagues is one of our distinguished designers, and he'll often kind of back us up a little bit and say, hey, look, what are we trying to do? Like, what's the human-centered outcome? And those kinds of questions are not technology questions. Those are questions that if you understand what the team is accomplishing, if you understand what that target user, who is probably not the IT professional or data scientist or line of business executive who's trying to make a decision about this or that platform, if you really understand what they're trying to do, then you can see, well, here's the things that go with it. If you skip that step, you end up with something that's just a huge waste of money, frankly.
And so we've talked about kind of the intent. There's intent of how do we want to create a user-centered outcome? I think you'd also mentioned in some of our previous conversations, kind of the intent of the enterprise. Like, does this fit with what we want to do with AI in the enterprise? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
For a lot of companies, if they allow or if they're encouraging the use of Gen AI or use of AI, because those are kind of separate things, subtle difference there, then you possibly end up in a world where you've got this Wild West, just proliferation of different architectures, different pieces of software, different solutions, and you kind of can't keep track of what's happening. And that becomes its own issue. And then second to that, one of the, I think, subtle problems is that even if you build a solution that aligns to that human-centered outcome, and we talk about, getting the right things, if you're not able to think through and build out something and you just kind of produce output, and hey, 2 years later, you can't see what came from a human and what came from an AI system, that's going to create problems too. And even on top of that, right, I think data fundamentally bridging all of this together, it's a data issue. In my experience, if you don't carefully work through, what are the data points you might need or be able to relate, and you just kind of jump in and go with what you got or go what you can get access to, then you end up with this kind of misrepresentation of what the capabilities of the system are. I was just meeting with some customers yesterday, and someone raised their hand during a Q&A and said, "Hey, we just added this chatbot to our system. What do I do with it? It's a black box. What do I even know what it's doing?" If you can't articulate that, then that's not great, right?
And so tell me a little bit more about data. So we've talked about user intent, strategic intent, making sure we're being human centered. We've also, in some of our previous conversations, talked about people kind of jumping in before they have their hands around the data that they have. Maybe talk a little bit about that if you would.
So my perspective is formed by having messed with the AI space for a couple of different revs of innovation. So 2017, someone asked me, "You took a master's class in AI. Can you help go figure out what the heck is going on here?" And that was really, truly the start of that journey for me. And at the time, it was about leveraging computer vision sorts of applications and all of the capabilities that were kind of emerging at that point. We're now seeing this really cool innovation around text and chat and all that kind of stuff too. And that extends, frankly, into time series too. But if you look at all the reasons why AI projects might fail, that we talked about some of these, like not having an idea of what the people are wanting to do, or not having the right stuff kind of surrounding the system. A huge portion of that comes back to data issues. And it's stuff like inadequate data, which I mentioned. It's stuff like for even classical AI problems or machine learning things, overfitting or underfitting. So you'll often hear people talk about some of those concepts in looking at the effectiveness of different AI models, like things as diverse as fraud detection models or computer vision things, and even other things too. But all of those, right, I think you can kind of back up and say, because we don't have a good view of what is the data set, what is the operating domain, because we don't have a good view of the kinds of things we're trying to do with the system, it really lessens the impact of whatever the project is. Because if I build you something as the chief architect for whatever it is, right? And we solve these problems based on my understanding of your data set. And it turns out I'm over here and the reality of the world is over here. It's just a bunch of wasted effort. We're going to have to go back through that. And all of those things are data issues.
And one of the things that you said that I thought was super impactful was there's a difference between having the data and being able to access that same data. So just because you have it doesn't mean you can access it. I thought that was a really important distinction.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think even taking a step further, there's the data you have, there's the data you might need, the data that if you were to combine this and this, you could get some really cool outcomes. But then on the other side of that, right, if you game it out, if you were to combine this and that would be a not good outcome. Understanding and working through all of those relationships really will showcase where use cases will be able to shine, or where you might even walk into issues too. And it's that kind of that approach, I think, that helps so much in getting to the difference between what will fall flat or what might actually go soaring off into huge success. For us and for the teams I work with, one of the first questions is always, cool, what did you do? What did you put into the system? What is the data set you have? How do we test? How do we validate it? And something that, again, I would actually offer to people is, as you're evaluating these different use cases, as you're evaluating maybe different models or approaches, start asking these questions of your team or asking these questions of the vendors you're working with kind of directly. What data set went into your model? What is the model you're using? You should be able to articulate that. What was the pre-training data set? What did you do to fine tune it? What did you do to align it if you're using a text model? All these things are just kind of gut checks that someone should be able to answer. And if they can't, or if they have to go fishing for it, that's to me a warning sign. And that's also why I think this area is one where having transparency, having everything be done in the open is so important. In fact, flipping this around, I would err on the side of being too cautious in this regard and say, hey, show me all the data that you put in. Show me data set samples. Show me these types of things and poke on it. They become litmus tests.
That's super interesting. Let's go a little bit further on how to pick the right model. Because again, we've talked about there's maybe some things that are a little bit more well established, but every week it seems like there's something new coming out. So how do you make that decision between maybe the latest and greatest versus something that's a little bit more tried and true?
Well, I think that the thing to unpack from your question a little bit there is so much innovation happening day by day. And it's almost hour by hour. I keep a couple of news feeds that I glance through a couple of times a day. And it's almost like clockwork that there's some new innovation that is just how we're doing it in quotes now, right? Take, for example, chat and assistants or co-pilots or bots, agent, whatever you want to call it. But think for a second about this. We've had AI assistants in little windows in the corners of websites for years, right? I think everyone has seen one of those that pops up, asks a question, and it just kind of moves you along. We now have, only in the last 23 months since you and I are talking about this, something that's a step change in advancement with the AI assistants that launched back in 2022 from ChatGPT and OpenAI. That's been less than 2 years. And even in that, we're seeing things like different patterns for software architecture emerge. I find it funny that no one really knew what a vector database was up until about a year ago. No one cared. Those were a thing. We knew how to use them quite well in the industry, but no one really started asking about that until we figured out that retrieval augmented generation is a thing. So all these things come together to say that everything's evolving rapidly. In that world where it's evolving rapidly, the fundamental use case, being able to articulate that intent, to articulate what data you have, what data you need, what data you might want to buy, and whatever you can't get for whatever reason, that's going to limit the world that you're kind of operating in. And I think the thing to look at here is to say, in picking a model, that model is only a small part of the solution. It might be open source. That model might be something that is provided by an API hosted on your system or my system or someone else's system, maybe running locally on a device. There's certain dimensions to kind of think through that are informed by what problem or use case you're trying to solve. For us, I think one of the best examples of this is from our software portfolio and sustainability, the IBM Maximo, which is what I'm the chief architect for. We consume time series data. We consume image data and video data. We consume structured text that's in databases and in forms and things like that. And all of those things we want to be able to relate together. So when you're picking models in that kind of world, it's more than just chat. So you need to understand what you have, what you can do with it, where you want to run it. And that starts to inform how you're going to do the computation and how you're going to build a solution around it. There are certain things like, so if even if I'm doing a chat system, let's just make up something, right? Even if I'm doing a chat system, cool, I can build you a chat system. But what if I want to run it offline on one of these? That's very different compared to running something that's online via a website. Designing for that means that you need to consider the model, consider how you're going to run it, consider the data you're going to need to push and pull through it, and know that it's going to evolve. Know that the system is going to need to take into account these advances that are happening in open source, in the state of the art knowledge that we know is we take for granted as industry. And then know that, frankly, as you roll out a use case, that you're going to have to course correct too, right? There's a reason why a lot of AI systems have little thumbs up and thumbs downs in them. That's because if they're good at what they're doing, they're going to take the feedback and use that to further advance the system. And all of that becomes this much better view of creating compelling signals to tell you're on the right track, or compelling signals to tell you, hey, here's a warning, please pay attention to it. If I kind of zero out or zoom back a little bit and take your answer about, or take my answer to, hey, what do you think about in building these and choosing a model? I'd say, think about the model as being this tiny little piece, and there being so much more of the system around it that you got to consider.
I love it. So we've talked about, I'm thinking kind of a three-way overlapping Venn diagram, right? We've talked about the user need or the strategic intent, like why we're doing this, what we're trying to accomplish. We've talked about the data. What data do we have? What can we access of what we have? And then we've also talked about the model, the trade-offs between the latest whiz-bang thing and something that's maybe a little bit more tried and true. Are there any other kind of do nots or kind of watch outs or pitfalls that you see out there outside of those three that you'd like to share right now?
I think if you fixate on the latest, greatest, and consider, I'm going to use a chat system because I have to have a chat system as a declaration, as opposed to closing a gap between where you are and where you need to be, that's a warning sign to me. That means that you haven't really gotten the right people in the room to have the right conversations to get to that sense of what's necessary and what's going to help and close things out. On top of that, if you're not designing for things to evolve over time and designing for a system to start from an MVP, yes, start from something that will give you a sense of where you're going, but also start from something that's going to give you good enough, where good enough might be better than a coin toss, or it might be 3 nines of accuracy per whatever, depending on the use case. It totally depends. You need to be able to design for that evolution over time. And finally, kind of wrapping up the software engineering perspective for a second, systems are complicated, even if it's just an API call. There are so many things that go into building a resilient piece of software that will fit into a broader enterprise solution. You have to consider all of those things. And I mentioned, for example, running on a mobile versus running on a web hosted backend. That's just one of them. There are things along those lines that if you start pulling on those threads, they'll start exposing all of the indirect requirements that are surrounding the AI systems that are just plain software engineering, plain project management sorts of things that need to happen. But because of the amplification of a wrong choice or a choice made here downstream, locking you into things, it becomes very expensive to undo if you're not careful and not considering it.
Fantastic. So I guess we've been talking a little bit about the things to avoid, right? Maybe we could now get into the more positive of what are the big kind of recommendations or insights that you'd want to share with fellow corporate AI executives on the things to do?
So first, let's talk about data. I mean, I think data is the new oil. It's what differentiates you from me, from your competitors, from others in the industry. And I cannot overemphasize that. There's this sort of I wouldn't say misunderstanding, but this behavior I see where people will say, hey, I've got this model that's been trained on some number of trillions of tokens and it can answer questions and also write a sonnet and all these other things. But that's not going to help when I need to understand how to figure out how to make the next correct maintenance action on some pump in a oil well in the middle of nowhere when I have no Wi-Fi, right? Like that's the real issue that will prevent somebody from being able to get their job done. Having that sense though of that data, that's what differentiates people. So flipping it around for a sec and saying, if you've done what I think a lot of companies have done, which is in say the 90s or 2000s, you modernized your tech stack, you probably have laying around somewhere by now, it's crazy to say this, almost a quarter century of stuff that it may be in spreadsheets, it may be in a database, it may be in an Access database, depending on how far back you went. But you have this data available to you. The question is, how can you leverage it? Because this is stuff that's about your operation. And this is now something that because of the step change in generative AI being able to pull signals from noise, we're now able to leverage that. An example of it, in our product in June, we just launched a Gen AI feature that allows someone to label a very small number of data points in a database. And then the Gen AI bit is that we take those data points and we use a generative model to create synthetic data that we then use to train a classic ML model. Under the covers, we're doing a whole data pipeline with all sorts of things with labeling and lineage and all sorts of stuff, right? But at the end of the day, I'm taking someone's operational data that they understand and they can leverage. I can unlock value from that and I can then deliver value back to them. And you see it in dollars and cents in terms of efficiency. That fundamental understanding is so important because that enables you to say, hey, based on my business, my understanding of my differentiation or my value or my competitive value, right, against others, here's what I know that no one else can quite get to. And now building on top of that, how can I organize that, combine it with other things, combine it with open industry data, or maybe a model that someone published that's open source, and start delivering insights from that. And I consider this as kind of a layered approach. If I can align on your intent, which is, hey, what's the thing when I put down my cup of coffee in the morning that's going to make me more effective in my job? If I can organize a data set that says, hey, here's what I got, here's what I need, et cetera, here's the things that I can then choose one of the models, because I know it's more than just a chat or more than just the new shiny object. I can then start saying, here's the insights. And those insights themselves can then drive action. And that's where you get to business value. And kind of considering each of those layers step by step, that shows you where you have to make decisions. It shows you where you're walking through a door where it's kind of hard to back up. And it also shows you, where you need to be able to be flexible in the system because, if I think about it, I'm going to keep giving you a better and better mousetrap, right? We know we're going to get better and better models. But if I design the system in a way where that model bit in the middle-ish, right, is one that we can swap in or swap out and understand that it's model version A, B, C, D, right, over time, then I can still deliver the same value. I just give you 0.1% better or 2% better, right? Or anything like that. So that approach is one that from IBM, we formalized. It's the way we run projects. And you can even find it on the website. If you go to ibm.com/design/AI, it's a freely available set of material that walks through kind of step by step those things. That's why I can rattle them off because that's how we do it.
And that's the IBM Design for AI website. We'll link to that in the show notes. I really love those 5. I didn't catch those 5 bits, but you said intent. So understanding the intent and why we're doing this, who the users are. Then the data, which is now that we have that intent, what data do we have to achieve that intent? And then after we know what data, what model, and then that model produces insights, and those insights lead to action. And so I thought that was a really nice way of kind of wrapping it up. And I think the point that you were making was that model in the middle, that's going to change because of the daily or hourly updates that we're getting on all these different ways of doing things. And so you need to be able to design flexibly in the middle of those kind of 5 steps. The model needs to not just be set in stone. So I guess, that was the to do when it comes to data, Mike. And then again, in some of our pre-conversations, you talked about organizing the data you do have first, and then thinking about the data you don't have. I thought that was really insightful. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that if you consider, hey, here's my differentiation, right? Here's what I've got. Here's my operations for some number of quarters, years, whatever it is, or here's the thing I can see from my particular application or my purview. There will be something that you can get from that. But consider, for example, someone who's doing operations and maybe doing fleet dispatch for trucks, right, to move around inventory. You can infer from shipping notices what went from where to where, right? You have that. That's a data point. That's totally something that you can then start drawing some conclusions from. The interesting thing to overlay on that is, for example, hey, weather. What is the weather pattern that went with these decisions? Because maybe these are correlated. Maybe they're not, right? Maybe it doesn't matter. But depending on what you're doing, maybe it is. And that becomes something that you can then use to say, there's a relationship here. And maybe it's a signal that needs to be pulled into the models or into the system or into the data flow that you can then start looking forward and saying, well, based on forecasts, we know that this is kind of what happens. And so therefore, we need to take this action. That's I think a simple example of this idea of like, what don't you have that you might need? And it's something that example is one you can just commercially get, right? You can go purchase that and it starts to unlock value from these data points, right? In addition, there's also some things that if you're honest about this and you really do have that conversation, there's going to be stuff that you just can't get. It's not going to be possible to get the, precise hyper local, I don't know, I'll pick on the weather example, like exactly how many millimeters of rain are going to fall on this exact GPS coordinate to 5 figures of precision. It's just not going to happen, right? You're not going to get a sense of what a future market prediction is going to be, a year out. It's just not going to happen. That kind of stuff would be useful to write down because maybe in a year or two, something gets unlocked and that becomes something that would be useful and differentiable. It's useful kinds of stuff like that you, in the exercise, it starts to highlight and capture points that will help the future you or your successors make better decisions. Again, unpacking a little bit there's also a complement, which is what would be an example of if I were to combine this and this, I'd get to a bad outcome. In the course where I mentioned up on the website, there's, I think one of the intros, a scenario of trying to create a welcome home feeling for someone who's a hotelier, right? So they're trying to just make their guests feel more comfortable, right? That's cool. I want that. I travel enough to enjoy that. What would happen though if I left Houston and left the TV on this setting and walked into a similar hotel in, I don't know, San Diego, and everything was just the way it was? How surreal would that be for a second? Would you want that necessarily? Like it's that subtle behavior becomes something to reason through. And that's a friendly example of it, right? But that becomes something that may be an unintended consequence of the use case or of the combination of things that you're gathering. Put another way, if I were to combine all these different signals, could I get into a situation where I would create a problem for myself because I'm now capturing stuff that by itself is all fine, but if I put it all together, becomes something that I have to keep track of because of different regulatory changes and stuff like that, right? All these things kind of come back to having a very firm understanding of the use cases and then the data models and stuff like that. And it will help you to be much more proactive in action as opposed to reactive.
And it's something we've kind of talked about a little bit here, but I wanted to go deeper. Understanding the intent of the human being or the user. So that's something that, a lot of people say that, but how do you actually do it, especially in the case of AI?
It is important. And in AI scenarios, the AI part of the solution is just part of the solution. No one's using AI for AI's sake. There's always something someone's trying to do, trying to get a laugh out of somebody. We're not just trying to create a chatbot for the sake of a chatbot. It's trying to do customer service or trying to help someone be effective in their job. So in understanding what that user pain point is, in understanding that extended team that's involved. I'm in Texas, so all y'all is part of my vernacular now, right? But understanding the all y'all, that is the line of business user, the architects, the stakeholders, both inside and outside of the team, you can start to see where there's a pain point in a better relief and start working on that issue. So an example of this, in our computer vision platform, we were doing a user experience research, just over the shoulder exercise. So this is an example of something that has nothing to do with AI, right? But it's perfectly applicable to understanding something that affects an AI system. So we're watching someone use the software, and they're using the software, they're building an AI model for whatever the use case is. And we noticed that the cursor kept zipping off screen as they were doing the workflow. And after a couple of times of that, the person running the interview eventually asked, so, hey, what's going on over here? Right. And the person said, oh yeah, I have a note file open and I'm keeping notes on what I'm doing because I want to understand, what the effect was on the system. And that is a perfect example of us building a software workflow and discovering that the true workflow of that person was one that we missed a step in. And so from that's great basic UX research, but it informs us to say, hey, so we talk about model lifecycle management or data lifecycle management or however you wanted to frame that AI lifecycle stuff. That was a very stark example of where we needed to do versioning. And that becomes a good view of the value of that human-centered design and the value of understanding the intent behind the outcome. That phrase, what's the intent behind the outcome? That's the best definition of design. That's from my colleagues that do this for a living, right? From the design perspective. That frames up so much of what's necessary, what is superfluous, and helps to prioritize things such that we can get something done that helps people along the way.
What's the intent behind the outcome? That's a great way to frame things.
If you think about it, right, understanding from a design perspective what you're trying to do, it gets at what's the intent behind the outcome. That intent behind the outcome is the best definition of design that I've heard. It's from my colleagues that do this for a living, right? It helps you to avoid situations where you end up creating something that's effectively a parlor trick. And you can see all sorts of really cool demos in the AI space right now, but so much of them are just that, right? They're just magic. And if you poke at it, it's not really going to help.
I love the word parlor tricks because I think what you're saying is that it's cool. We can build it. It looks interesting, but it doesn't actually solve a problem for a human.
Oh, absolutely. Take the example of chat. I mean, I literally, every time I talk to clients or partners, at some point in the conversation, I make a point that AI is more than just a chatbot. So much right now of the energy is wrapped around chat systems and assistants and all those different sorts of solutions. And because of that, I think there's this over rotation toward these different, like, niche things. But if they're not really solving a problem that someone who's working in their day to day would acknowledge, what was the value of that? It's expensive to do some of these things, right? And it's expensive to hire a team of people to build a solution. And if I build something that, yes, accomplishes the list of 27 requirements, but doesn't make someone more effective in their job, or it doesn't offer them, something that, saves them time or saves them effort, or increases the quality of their work, then what the heck are you doing? I look at this, all of our AI innovations that at least I see, I can kind of bucket them into two buckets. One is a evolutionary advancement. That's the example I made about saying, hey, if you design the system appropriately, that AI model in the middle can automate processes or can be incrementally improving existing processes such that I can give you value that's 1% better than what you had before, right? And if you do something enough times, that 1% adds up and the TCO works out. On the other side of this is revolutionary advancements. And chat, as an example of this, right? Chat can be revolutionary. It takes, though, delivering a truly differentiated value for that individual, right? Whoever they are in whatever role, to understand what that might mean to them. And so take chat, right? Take an assistant. It's one thing to be able to open up an assistant and make like an IT ticket, or, say, hey, the washroom soap dispenser is out, go restock it or something like that, right? Why does that need to be a chat system? I can fill out 2 form fields and hit go and be done with it. Where's the differentiation and value for that? Maybe there is differentiation and value in it because the system understands the context of where the user is, and the utterance really is this bathroom soap dispenser is out. And that's the end of the statement. And I'm relating, hey, they're standing outside of this in this building, or like, their Wi-Fi. Like, I can kind of infer from other signals, right? Other data available to me. Here, I think you're at this location. Is that correct? And then help them along their way. There's opportunities there, but if you don't reason through it, you really won't get to something that's really truly differentiated and truly valuable.
So much goodness here. And so, I understand the all y'all. I love that. I think that should be institutionalized somewhere, avoiding parlor tricks, asking what's the intent behind the outcome, and looking beyond the evolutionary towards the revolutionary. Those are all great pieces of advice. So I guess as we kind of approach the end of our time together on this particular episode, maybe the lightning round of what are the top 3 things that you might just leave with your fellow corporate AI executives that would help them to drive real value and avoid wasting a bunch of time and money?
I think one is you definitely need to get in the game, right? I think that sitting on the sidelines at this point is doing your company and your team a disservice. And starting from just inventory of data, even before you get into projects, will start to unlock value immediately. And at the worst case, maybe you'll discover you've been backing up something for 10 years that you don't need anymore. And you can just stop that, right? The second thing is the patterns that are emerging as the software solutions around AI are becoming industry standard, are patterns that are evolving. And it's maybe 30 years ago, microprocessor architectures were different. And they kind of are today. There's a couple of major standards for how things work. But several decades ago, they were radically different standards. And that was how it was, right? Things were evolving, different teams were differentiating in different ways. You need to design for that and account for that and set aside uncertainty or risk planning or risk mitigation for that. And know that what you built now is going to evolve in a quarter or a year. The final point is to consider the kinds of data that you have. So there is absolutely value through chat and text and documents and stuff in databases. All of that, I think, you can combine with other kinds of data as well. So if you were to really tease apart and look at like image data, look at sensor or IoT or time series data, look at text or structured text data, right? All of those things will give you a sense of the broader use cases that maybe you can address, and maybe you can add that incremental value for your end user, and maybe you can unlock value for them or for their customers. If you go look at the IBM website, we've got a lot of material that helps to just kind of reason through things. It's our approach, right? It's the approach that I found at least works from my experience on the projects I've worked on. All of that, though, with that said, if you find an approach that works for you, that gets at those similar kinds of things, that's what's important, right? It's asking those questions and taking stuff to the next level. That'll definitely help.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Talk soon.
Cheers. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Lean AI podcast. We hope you found our conversation with Mike as insightful and inspiring as we did. Remember, the true potential of AI lies not just in the technology itself, but in how we as leaders integrate it into our organizations to drive meaningful change. The Lean AI podcast is brought to you by Lean Startup Co. To find out more about our Lean AI approach to generating more AI wins with far less wasted time and investment, including our training workshops, pilot programs, and full implementation offerings, visit us at www.leanstartup.co. Search the Lean AI podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Lean Startup Co., thanks for listening and sharing with your colleagues and friends if you found this episode insightful.